The two subcultures that made the most significant contribution to the birth of the hippie movement were the American folk music revival and the beatniks. But the beatniks were the most important predecessors of the hippies. Within this tribe, they were disillusioned with the American way of life, vehemently opposed to conformity, and very willing to tread outside of cultural norms to find some sense of truth or meaning. To the squares who criticized and condemned the Beats, specifically as they were portrayed in Jack Kerouac's On the Road, they were frenetic young men and women racing furiously across America to wherever life is fastest, the girls are hottest, parties wildest, bop to be heard, a marijuana to be smoked, or a road to be taken at 90 miles per hour plus, a neurotic hunger for sensation and experience. The Beats gravitated to modern jazz, but also studied Zen Buddhism, and their anti materialism and anti establishment views bordered on anarchy. Norman Mailer had coined the word hipster, referring to the rebellious youth of his time. One is hip or one is square. One is a rebel or one conforms. One is a frontiersman in the wild west of American nightlife, or else a square cell trapped in the totalitarian tissues of American society, doomed willy nilly to conform if one is to succeed. In the mid 1960s, San Francisco was in the transition from beat to hip, and exactly what that difference was about to unfold. The Beats were into jazz, and the Folkies had gravitated toward American roots music. But to these two fringe groups, it wasn't all about the music. The gatherings at the coffee houses revolved primarily around books and ideas. Both were very literate enclaves. In San Francisco, there were several poetry readings each week that drew both beatniks and folkies to either the coffee houses or to Lawrence Ferlinghetti's City Lights bookstore. And the esoteric reading material to be found there was as outside of American cultural norms as were the values of the clients that read them. Hermann Hesse's A Journey to the East, Steppenwolf, and Siddhartha were extremely popular. By the end of the 1960s, Hesse would become the biggest selling German author in the United States. There were other rare books on philosophy like the Kybalion, a study of the Hermetic philosophy of ancient Egypt and Greece, Tibetan Book of the Dead, and Zohar were all available. Also popular were science fiction novels like Stranger in a Strange Land and Childhood's End, which would become literary mainstays amongst the merry pranksters and followers of that enclave. And among the technical works, one could find Huxley's The Doors of Perception and eventually The Psychedelic Experience. Though it would be inaccurate to assert that every folky, beatnik, and hippie smoked marijuana, it is very reasonable to speculate that most did. The mere fact that members of these subcultures were willing to join the semi secret society of marijuana smokers meant that they were willing to break the law. And when these individuals transitioned to an attitude where they questioned the government's legitimacy regarding marijuana laws, it was frequently followed by a psychological shift where they questioned all authority. Like the beatniks, the hippies were disillusioned with the conformity of American life and embraced an anti establishment attitude which included smoking marijuana and exploring Eastern mysticism. But the most important catalyst that drove the schism between the Beats and the hippies was the psychedelic revolution of the mid 1960s, as LSD and the other psychedelic drugs found their way into academia and the beatnik subculture. Those communities were soon divided into the aware and the rest, and this division over the embrace or rejection of psychedelic drugs drove the schism further. Where the Beats musical genre had been jazz, the hippies, who were half a generation younger, gravitated toward rock and roll. Where the beatniks embraced a philosophy of nihilism, seeking escape in a meaningless culture, the hippies were far more optimistic, striving towards some kind of positive change, either within themselves or in society at large. And change became the hallmark of the hippie revolution. There is no easy way to explain the cultural revolution that took place in the 1960s. One cannot point to a single event and say, there, that was the spark that lit it all. In fact, the word that best describes it is zeitgeist, or a spirit of that particular period in history. Although the psychedelic revolution, political rebellion, art, and sex, drugs, rock and roll were all key elements, the most important common denominator may have been a generation with an overwhelming desire to change. Change jobs and spouses, change clothes and hairstyles, change religion, politics, and values. Maybe more important than change was to try, experiment, and question everything. And there were 20 million baby boomers leading the charge of question everything. But if you are serious about questioning the cultural values that were handed to you by a previous generation and attempting to seek out a more rewarding way of life, then the crucial question becomes, what direction? It is not surprising that a generation of youth would be disillusioned and seek new direction after being bombarded with the glitz of rock and roll, the unreal two-dimensional TV programs, blasé dead-end jobs, cookie-cutter suburbs, shallow consumerism, and keeping up with the Joneses. Governments that couldn't be trusted, a war that made no sense, and an ever-present fear of the bomb. To an older generation, it was an insult that these richest, most pampered adolescents in the history of the world would reject the very things that they had worked so hard to achieve. But to the boomers, the American corporate way of life was a sham. The all-powerful corporations were attacked as the very source of what was wrong in America. Imperialism around the globe, and specifically Vietnam, and materialism and consumerism as a benchmark to measure one's success. The very material achievements that their parents were so proud of were dismissed by the baby boomers as ugly, shallow, and potentially ecologically hazardous. But it wasn't just the corporations. It was also the military-industrial complex, and eventually it boiled down to the all-encompassing term, the establishment. The establishment was the term that represented an invisible elite who were weaving their conspiracy of money to exert their power into the lives of everyone. And it wasn't just the corporations. Politicians, labor unions, teachers, and reporters were all suspect. There was only one political party remaining, and that was the party of money. Republicans and Democrats were just two different faces of the establishment. Of course, not every youngster in the 1960s subscribed to the new radical views. For each one who fervently wanted to dismantle the establishment, there were 9 or more who just wanted to get out of high school, get a decent job, get laid, and hopefully get out of being drafted for service in Vietnam. For every kid that grew his hair long, smoked grass, listened to rock music, and spouted some form of radicalism, there were probably 10 kids or more who wore crew cuts, drank beer, loved football, and aspired to buying the coolest car that they could afford. But to an alarmed older generation, it didn't seem that way, because the radical minority were the ones who were getting the press. There have been few times in the course of human history when culture, art, science, and a new political radicalism simultaneously coalesced into a new social consciousness. But in the 1960s, when the Beatles, LSD, the war in Vietnam, the assassinations, the sexual revolution, and the civil rights movement all came into focus at the same time, was one such moment. Up until 1965, change still seemed to be moving with glacial slowness. The 1960s hadn't really begun. In comparison, the second half of the decade would move at the speed of light. The word hippie was first used in an article written by journalist Michael Fallon appearing in a September 1965 issue of the San Francisco Examiner. Borrowing Norman Mailer's term hipster and contracting it into the term hippie, the new word was born. The article was actually about a coffee house called the Blue Unicorn, but within the piece one could find this new term hippie and information about a growing phenomenon called the Haight-Ashbury, which was a 25-block district named for the intersection of two streets. Haight Street ran pretty much east-west, dead ending at the west end at Golden Gate Park. The north-south Ashbury Street intersected Haight near the middle of the district. The Haight-Ashbury was a neighborhood of houses that were formerly expensive Victorian mansions built in the teens. But with time, the district's formerly splendid houses had become a shabby, run-down, hole-in-the-wall area. One could find ornate mansions with leaded glass windows and lavish ballrooms for rent for as cheap as a few $100s a month. Some of the beats that had formerly resided in the North Beach district started finding their way to the new hip neighborhood. In the beginning, it was quite clear that these new hippies of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district were just second-generation beats still on the same familiar path of creating an alternative culture. But one of the early recognizable aspects regarding the hippies were their names. Baptismal given names were replaced with new self-appointed, sometimes psychedelic names like Sunshine, Rainbow, Harmony, Karma, Saffron, Buzz, Echo, River, Coyote, and Moonbeam. Some hypothetical Midwest kid born Delbert Jones in Austin, Texas, finds his way to the Haight-Ashbury and reinvents himself as Moonbeam. The original Delbert still resides deep within the young man, but to the cool community of hippies, he is Moonbeam, and it's the only name that his hippie friends have ever known. Many people came to the Haight-Ashbury seeking change, and one of the biggest changes to make was to change who you were by creating a new name that, for a time, was the new you. Inherited from their beatnik predecessors, the hippies embraced the idea that they were a bohemian group that subscribed to unconventional political and philosophical values. They also inherited some of the drugs, like marijuana. But what truly drew the line between the beats and the hippies was the latter's embrace of LSD. And with the use of LSD came a positive spiritual perspective which brought the hippies to reject the nihilism of the beats. The hippies, like many romantic bohemians that came before them, venerated their own sect of noble savages. For the bohemians of the 19th century, it was the gypsies. For the beatniks, it was the African-American jazz musicians. But for the hippies, it would be the American Indians. Most of the hippies that roamed the streets of the Haight-Ashbury were not merchants or dealers, were not psychedelic disciples, but more or less shared a cultural identity. And one of the most prevalent common interests was the meaning of technology and a concern with ecological responsibility. This particular focus was something unique to the hippies, definitely not inherited from the beats, and outside of drug use was the most prevalent concern within the burgeoning hippie community. There were many subgroups existing within the larger hippie community, various brands of Jesus freaks, including psychedelic Christians. New Age cosmic travelers and mystics, Krishna devotees, and unfortunately, far too many bottom rung druggies who saw psychedelics as just another thrill. There were also the politicos, and the new psychedelic revolution overlapped with the new left, but not all of the psychedelic travelers were interested in political solutions, and not all of the politicos were into drugs. The schism between the factions would become apparent as the decade progressed. The hippies in the Haight Ashbury rarely organized political demonstrations where they would announce demands. Though naive as it may seem in retrospect, they by and large felt that they were part of an unprecedented undercurrent that was going to change the world. At virtually the same time that the hippie psychedelic revolution was taking place, there was also a sexual revolution emerging across the nation and the Western world. The most important contribution to the sexual revolution was the birth control pill becoming widely available in the early 1960s. For the first time ever, the little pill gave women much more control over their own reproductive process and allowed them the freedom to enjoy sex or even casual sex without the fears of unwanted conception. One cannot understate the importance of how the pill allowed women the freedom to be sexually active without being tied to all of the commitments that conception included. And when these young men and women blended this newfound sexual freedom into a subculture that was already discarding all of the cultural norms of the previous generations, then sexual relationships themselves morphed into new forms that could be shocking to mainstream America. Though at the same time homosexuality was coming out and there was a small amount of uncommon experimentation like partner swapping, threesomes, and group sex, the most prevalent result of the sexual revolution was the ability to have casual sex and move from partner to partner without long range commitment, a privilege that previous generations had never known. For a certain portion of the hippie community that were stable enough both financially and psychologically and possessed the right brand of emotional self confidence, sexual hopscotch became accepted. For an enlightened subset not concerned about marriage, long range commitments, or requiring undying love, flitting from partner to partner became common in a subculture where inhibitions were being discarded daily and everything from their parents' culture was being questioned. Marriage itself could be seen as obsolete, or at the very least, something to be experimented with and altered to fit the coming counterculture. Sexually transmitted diseases were an ever present hazard, but with the invention of penicillin, it was accepted that nearly everything was curable. While at Harvard in 1962, Dr. Timothy Leary estimated that approximately 25,000 Americans had tried at least one of the main psychedelic drugs. In 1965, in a study conducted by Dr. Richard Alpert, he estimated that the number had risen to 4 million. 70% of the LSD users in Alpert's study were described as aged from late teens to early 20s. The psychedelic drugs had clearly moved from the clinics and the psychiatrists' couches to the streets in an upsurge greater than anything previously experienced in the United States. In early 1966, while Time magazine's medical section was reporting that there was an LSD epidemic, the same magazine's cultural pages were announcing oddball cult groups proliferating across the nation. Very quickly, in nearly every major city, there were small communities of what Time magazine called acid heads. And while none of the other cities ever had an enclave anywhere near the size of San Francisco's Haight Ashbury, all of them were remarkably similar, a community of college educated intellectuals wearing avant garde clothing and talking about LSD as a new sacrament of the coming Renaissance. And then there was marijuana. Marijuana was a politically divisive drug, and pretty much citizens stood on one side or the other of that political line. To the squares, it was alien, possibly dangerous, and above all, it was illegal. But if you were one of the intellectually curious who had tried marijuana, you immediately became aware of the glaring contradictions between the heightened experience provided by the drug and the official condemnations being spouted by the government and the mainstream media. The revelation that marijuana was not the big boogeyman that the experts claimed it to be was very convincing evidence that the authorities were either lying or ignorant, and the fact that it remained illegal strongly indicated that lying and stupidity were the foundation of our government's drug laws and maybe other policies. Any youngster in America that turned on to marijuana, if they had a reasonable amount of intellect, immediately realized that the narcotics laws were a hoax, which led many to speculate what other factions within our government are either lying or incompetent. Marijuana virtually became a catalyst, dividing the society into the obedient and the new radicals who questioned the myths being spouted by the ruling class. Beings both were linked in the same subculture, it is difficult to understand the politics of LSD without understanding the politics of marijuana. Both had the aura of outlaw in their use. For many, the first time they smoked marijuana, they were initiated into a secret society. Curtains drawn, incense burning, and hushed voices as the joint passed around. In some senses, smokers donned the persona of a criminal against the state. The fact that marijuana was both fun and illegal added an element of excitement to its use. When one entered the secret society, you were now part of an underground tribe, living clandestinely and hidden within the mainstream. For those who had gone a step further and willingly tried LSD, the wisdom acquired in the process created a feeling of separation from those who had not had the experience. Anyone who had turned on could find it very difficult to relate to anyone of a distinctly older mindset. Their in-group became their primary source for both acceptable ideas about the world and reliable information. The hippies took on the task of educating themselves with sources outside of mainstream channels, and in the process fed one of the most distinct generation gaps in human history. When the demographic consuming any commodity increases in size, driving up demand, the inevitable result is a segment of entrepreneurs that profit by providing the supply to meet the growing demand. From the smugglers bringing in hundreds of kilos, to the big dealers turning pounds, to the street dealers selling ounces, to the hippies on the street dealing in nickel bags or even single joints, dealing marijuana was probably the single most important economic base of the hippie community. Nearly every hippie sold a little marijuana, and eventually, for some, there was no other way of making a living. Marijuana became fashionable not only in the Haight-Ashbury, but also on college campuses across the nation. In the mid-1960s, a few score of daring smugglers were transporting more and more grass from Mexico to the growing market in San Francisco. But as the demand on college campuses exceeded supply, a new market was born, and because of their previous experience, the wholesale dealing business, by default, fell into the hands of the hippies. Marijuana smuggling was equal parts of good old American free enterprise and cops and robbers' danger and excitement. But the LSD trade was more like a heroic underground resistance movement. The psychedelic chemists, hidden in their secret laboratories, playing a dangerous chess game against the authorities, were often more focused on a mission to change mankind than they were on any profits. To many hippies, including the underground chemists, LSD was seen as a sacred tool that was going to change the world. But it is an inescapable fact that all of these drugs were also commercial commodities, and the fact that they were both sacred and commercial would bring them into a vortex of conflict between philosophical ideals and capitalist drive for profits that would divide the subculture around these two motives. Eventually, drug trafficking in harder drugs would devolve into an ugly world of money, power, and violence, and the hippies' former assertion that marijuana and LSD were sacraments of a dawning new age would be eclipsed by the horrors of addiction and shattered lives. The hippies were intricately interwoven with a variety of activist movements. The psychedelic revolution, the anti-war movement, women's liberation, and environmentalism were all spawned within the hippie revolution. A good argument can be made that it was actually the protesters that brought the Vietnam War to a close. And women's rights movements and environmentalism have long outlived the hippie era. But eventually, the majority of the hippies were too drug-oriented to have any sense of urgency with regard to any brand of activism. Far too many of them were focused on instant gratification. Unlike activists who have a narrow focus to bring about change, the hippies devolved into a narrow focus of drug use, which resulted in no coherent vision for the future. But the unpleasant possibility is that the hippies may have been right. They may have been right in believing that the future is an inevitable disaster, and why not live for today? Why not reject the norms dealt out by the establishment with all its square obligations and find your own path? One can become quite demoralized by taking a deep look into the question, what if the hippies were right? If you found this subject interesting, then I recommend that you seek out the two companion documentaries, The Psychedelic Revolution of the 1960s and The Haight-Ashbury at its Highest. If you have a passion about this subject and would like to learn more about what happened to the leading voices in the psychedelic revolution, then I urge you to seek out my book, Rebellion, a 300-year saga of one family struggle with authority, the Shays Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, New Orleans, Storyville, Pendergast's Kansas City, the Haight-Ashbury, and beyond.